Peace and God's blessings be upon you. My name is Ayham As-Sukhni. I work at the Qatari Red Crescent, Head of International Relations. Thank you for bearing with us to reach the third and final session. You've made it. You've made it all the way to the third session. After a long day and lengthy discussions, we continue and we appreciate that you have made it all the way to the session. Today, we will have also 3 speakers in the session. Ms. Sandra Pertek, Mr. AbdulRahman AlMutawa, and Mr. Andrew Adam-Bradford. I will start by introducing the speakers and then we will give them the chance to speak. Sandra is a Senior Research Fellow at the International Development Department at the University of Birmingham. She has assumed academic and research position at the University of Queen Margaret and the Institute of Migration Research. She worked on gender-based violence in forced migration, and this is a topic that is very important and a topic of discussion in our region, and the intersection between religion and gender-based violence, especially in forced migration. She led many research papers in the Middle East and North Africa, and she provided advice and consultancy to many international organizations on gender issues, and she now leads a project funded by QARI that aims to integrate Islamic system with international system to enhance the support provided to displaced women. So Islamic charity and also humanitarian international law and their intersection is very important, especially that in our religion there are many tools and resources that can be used, especially talking about displaced and migrating women. Dr. Sandra, you have the floor, and you have 15 minutes. Go ahead, please. شكرا جزيلا رئيس الجلسة.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear excellencies, it's an honor to be with you here today and present Bridging the Research Practice and Policy Divide, Advancing Responses to Global Displacement. This is the topic that deprives me of sleep every day almost. It's the way I'm thinking. Doing all this research for the last 7 years, does it really matter? How can we make sure that what we are investing our resources and time into and money really makes a difference? And it is obviously a dual case of pragmatic and moral imperative for us to do our best, and our previous speakers addressed this very, very well. I would just emphasize coordinating resources and talents is just key for any successful improvement of humanitarian work. So in my role, I address the research and humanitarian challenge. This is a dual challenge too. Women in displacement who face unprecedented levels of violence. You probably know the number of displaced people is growing yearly. There are over 120 million people displaced nowadays, and every day the number increases. But women and girls and children, as well as men, have been subjected to specific vulnerabilities and specific issues in displacement processes. The life-threatening journeys and lack of mobile services basically deprives people of basic needs and rights to be fulfilled. So there are some quotes of the women that I met in my studies in the last 7 years during my PhD and postdoctoral journey. I have interviewed maybe 60 survivors and read 200 transcripts, and the violence that they have suffered is unspeakable. We can't really comprehend the level of different types of violence, from structural to symbolic and physical direct violence. So we know also that the displaced populations in majority, over half of them are situated in Muslim majority countries. And there are fragmented responses, there is limited capacity, political will to address those humanitarian crises, as the scale of displacement has exceeded any available resources and political will that we witness nowadays. So I was intrigued by the lack of insufficient solutions as the problems grow, and I turned into Islamic philanthropy as a very effective mechanism for centuries that have been alleviating suffering of people as the way for innovating solutions to displacement. And I have been now, blessed, alhamdulillah, with a new project that I can run with the UK Research and Innovation Funding called Making It Work for Displaced Women. This program is a transformative research project, secured over £1 million value for the next 4 years. But the way it is planned is not just research on its own. It's a policy-oriented capacity-building program that engages diverse partnerships and collaborators to make a difference. As you can see in the work packages that I have just introduced on this slide, there are 3 desk-based primary research and policy engagement initiatives that engage with a range of stakeholders, starting from CHS, that are part of the program as partners, as well as IFRC, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, based in Geneva, and Islamic Development Bank, for example, as well as World Humanitarian Action Forum that has coordinated World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. So the expectations for this program are to critically analyze and integrate faith-based and secular approaches to aid to improve outcomes for women, drawing on the religious resources that are existing in Islam and cultures, the different cultures that different nations use to support displaced people, and in a way that support women's rights. So the vision of this project is a life-saving integrated aid for women in displacement to leverage enormous potential of Islamic philanthropy to improve outcomes for women. And here, in addition to case studies that we will run in Bangladesh with Rohingya communities, as well as African migrants in Kenya and diverse refugees in Turkey as well as the UK, we aim to develop coordinated, locally led research studies in those communities that will be led by the communities themselves to understand what are their current needs. So even though we have a pre-designed program together with partners, we will be adapting and tailoring this to local consultations and local voices and local researchers that will run local case studies. Lots of locals in that last sentence. Okay. The result that I hope that we will achieve are the policy dialogues that aim to co-develop guidance notes for supporting displaced women for Islamic philanthropy actors. So I've seen that there's a gap. Islamic philanthropy actors, such as international humanitarian organizations that work with zakat or sadaqah or waqf, rarely adapt to any standards or specific guidance notes that can help them to maximize the impact by looking at specific needs of women, men, boys, and girls in the humanitarian crisis. So it's about integrating inclusion and protection lens to Islamic philanthropy initiatives. Okay, and now, given this background, what I've been doing, I will introduce what I think about the challenges and opportunities for integrating research and practice based on the experience of my previous projects that led me to that big project. First of all, I would like to share with you that there is this fundamental principle in relation to any integration. If we talk about integration, it is always a two-way street. There must be a will from 2 parties or 2 different areas of work that we engage with for them to work together. Each of them must come with a hand forward, be willing to engage with the other stakeholder. If one party is not willing, it will not work. So building trust and early engagement for effective integration of research and practice is essential. Building trust, it took me perhaps with some organizations maybe up to maybe even 7 years with some organizations to get to the stage where they enter with me into a large-scale program. With other stakeholders, it can take shorter, but it's very important to invest your time and energy into building meaningful relationships with professionals across different disciplines. What we are doing here is we aim to connect different cultures of aid, different disciplines, and different sectors. So we bring stakeholders from humanitarian background, but they will be approaching this issue from a multidisciplinary perspective. They may look at this from business perspective or psychological perspective or perhaps religious studies. There are different ways of looking at it. And there are some challenges, primarily that many people have different interests. Even if we all want to make a difference and we want to change the world for a better, to be a better place, we will be guided by different interests, and it's important to align and identify joint interests and shared interests. With regards to another challenge, there are issues of uptaking recommendations. Even if we develop the best recommendations in the world, some organizations simply may not prioritize them because they were either not involved at the development stage, they didn't feel ownership of this recommendation, and it will be just a wasted recommendation in our papers. I will explain now what I mean by sharing with you 9 collaboration strategies for impact and capacity building. First example relates to the partnership agreement that I built with the IFRC and University of Birmingham. We started from a roundtable process in Geneva, where we convened 4 meetings to discuss with missions, NGOs, UN agencies, the gaps in supporting survivors of sexual gender-based violence cross borders. And there are so many gaps in this discipline. Basically, many people fall through the cracks. They are not supported sufficiently on the move in the refugee journey. Everything can happen, from trafficking, kidnapping, or all different types of violence are happening. So we discussed through this process potential opportunities for agencies to enhance coordination. This led us as partners to commit to a joint secondment. So I went to IFRC on a secondment to develop a guidance note for them for humanitarian service points, how to address gender-based violence in migration settings at the humanitarian service points. And in the end, we signed a collaboration agreement, thanks to which I could involve them, for example, in the first project that I have outlined in the beginning. Another example is running regular consultations with the sector. So one of my PhD outcomes related to developing guidance on protection from violence against women and girls by integrating religion as a factor, as a protective or risk factor. And I will share with you these policy briefings if you are interested. I will leave them here in front if you want to see the outcomes. The way I approached this task of developing a policy brief for different stakeholders was to engage with them and ask what they could potentially do, so I can embed within the policy brief exactly what is possible to be done and assign responsibilities to specific stakeholders instead of making generic recommendations. These consultations engaged with the sector as a whole. There were participants from governmental level, civil society, UN agencies, and thanks to this consultation, I developed a guidance note that was well received, hopefully. Well, the feedback I received was positive, but I couldn't have done it if I didn't run these consultation meetings where I shared the findings and I asked additional questions to different stakeholders, what they think about the findings and what else is missing in them. Those policy briefs will be shared. One that I would like you to pay attention to is called Prioritizing Protection and Inclusion of Conflict-Affected Displaced Women and Girls in Muslim majority context. That's where I target key institutions in the Muslim world, such as the OIC and Islamic Development Bank, for example, as well as INGOs in the Muslim world. So this is where we center women in aid delivery. We look at the specific issues that women and men face, because there are different issues that we face when we are in crisis, isn't it? Okay, and example 4 relates to research co-production. So one of the other projects that I ran was in Ukraine and Poland. It was to identify Ukrainians at risk of trafficking and gender-based violence. That's where we worked in this very difficult environment through community-based researchers. So we partnered up with a national welfare organization service provider called Convictus, and they have delegated their staff who are social workers to be trained as community-based researchers, and we were able to conduct the study during the war in the early phase in 2022. And we also co-developed infographics to inform refugees about their rights and potential risks during their journeys across Europe. And we also run a number of public engagement initiatives with the policymakers in Warsaw. I'm originally from Poland, by the way, but I live in England. So it was a very good opportunity for me to bring back something to the country that I come from, and engage with the government there and local NGOs who stood up and created a humanitarian response overnight when the Ukrainians arrived to Poland. Okay, example 5 are trainings. So I continuously identify opportunities for different stakeholders to learn about research findings and different things that we've been doing with my colleagues in teams across different research projects. One of the policy impact funds that I have received from University of Birmingham and Research England was on engaging with the OIC and UNHCR to strengthen collaboration around women's protection. So I went to Jeddah several times to do trainings, for example, with the UNHCR on women in displacement. And similarly, I've done a training with UNHCR in Warsaw for public officials in Poland too. But it was a different topic. It was on intersectional gender analysis in policy and program planning for effective refugee protection and inclusion. Another example, number 6, it's knowledge exchange sessions and debriefs with private sector and intergovernmental multilateral banks, such as the Islamic Development Bank, for example. So I worked there as a consultant before. I had good connections with colleagues, and what I discovered that it's very important to keep people updated about what you are doing. Otherwise, people move on and they will never know what you do. And everyone is just in their own bubble, and everyone is so much pressed by ongoing priorities and pressures of daily life and work pressures. So with these colleagues in IDB, I have initiated visits again, and slowly we had discussions around displacement issues in the Muslim world, and one of the opportunities that we found is to have a debrief session and a learning exchange session for all the country offices who are willing to join to discuss how we can build women's resilience in conflict in displacement. So this is continued, and it carried on to policy events as well. So another opportunity for enhancing coordination, integration between research and practice are policy initiatives and organizing events, disseminating knowledge, and encouraging, discussing recommendations and implementation. One example is UNCSW, the Commission for the Status of Women, and Interministerial FCDO Conference on Sexual Violence in Conflict. And a few more minutes left. Example 8, it's a training that was developed based on the book. So I co-authored one book called On the Significance of Religion in Violence Against Women and Girls, where we present a Muslim and Christian perspective on the role of religion in countering or contributing to violence against women. And interestingly, the European Commission picked up on this book, and they requested us in consultancy capacity to run trainings for them on engaging with gender, religion, and violence. So this was really interesting because we turned this knowledge product into a training and something practical, and I really love that, yeah. And I felt that finally something practical, not just writing. Example 9, okay, I come from a practitioner background from humanitarian world before, so I like to put things into action. Number 1, it's disseminating findings through infographics. So very often we are faced with a dilemma: how are we going to communicate very sensitive and traumatizing material to wider audiences? Infographics are interesting ways of putting sensitive and difficult issues into an illustration, and people can learn about. In here, this example of Aisha's story was her experience of trafficking in Libya during her migratory journey towards Europe from Sierra Leone. And in summary, before I leave, this is just an overview of positive practices that I encourage and invite you to implement or upscale in your own practice. So again, co-production in research, co-authoring opportunities for practitioners and academics together to write things together, that's the most effective, and journals also like that. Collaboration in dissemination and advocacy, regular feedback sessions, consultations to inform outcomes. So before we finalize studies, it's important to get people's perspectives on board, knowledge sharing sessions and roundtables to develop solutions, identify responsibilities for these solutions. So when we had a project in the UK on forced migrants' experiences of sexual gender-based violence, we would work directly with the Home Office and NHS to identify what can they do. So before we publish a report with recommendations, we would have them on board committing to things that they can do. Otherwise, we wouldn't put it in the report because we know nobody will really implement it. Okay, finally, fostering innovation is to test solutions and pilot small-scale projects to innovate new innovative ways of improving addressing humanitarian concerns, and finally, sharing findings at the policy platforms of different kinds at different levels, from local to international. Thank you for your attention, and I welcome your questions.
شكرا دكتورة ساندرا.
Thank you, Dr. Sandra. A very important and inspiring experience, specifically talking about women who are forcibly displaced, and the responsibility of researchers, practitioners, media people to enhance the protection of women in forced displacement or migration. Moving on to Mr. AbdulRahman, who is the General Supervisor of the Global Center for Philanthropy Study Kuwait. He has a long experience in institutional work. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Kuwait, as well as professional diplomas in social leadership, human resources, Islamic banks and Islamic banking, and NGO work, a certificate from Spain. Also, a Tamkeen initiative is one of the important initiatives that Mr. AbdulRahman worked on, which aims at elevating the levels of those working in humanitarian sector, cooperating with the Ministry of Social Development in Kuwait. He is interested in innovation and documentation of experience in this field. In the name of Allah, most merciful, most compassionate, peace and mercy be upon Prophet Muhammad and his family and companions. We thank the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies for hosting me in this important conference. I am lucky to be the penultimate speaker. Of course, you are all tired waiting for lunch, but let me start with an exciting story, just to de-stress and move away from all these technicalities. When I started working in philanthropy, I saw the establishment of a village in one African country, and the influential people, influencers, went to this village and shot videos with these people, and this village was built at the cost of $100 million, and the influencers were talking about the village and how they transformed these people from living in the desert into having a house with a bedroom, a living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. Around 50 houses and 2 classrooms, 1 healthcare center, and 1 well of water, and 1 tank. So it was a comprehensive village in the middle of the desert. I was motivated. I told my institution that I wanted to visit this village. I left Kuwait and I reached this country. In order to go to this village, it took me around 2 hours in the car. Of course, it's a secluded, arid area. And suddenly I saw that village in front of me. And it was really majestic to see philanthropy and this level of innovation. I went inside the village. I saw the locals. I saw the children in the classroom. And I was surprised. Outside the village, there were barrels of water. I asked them, what is this? They said, every week the government prepares barrels of water so that we can use them. And I said, what about the well? They said it seems that they haven't reached groundwater with this well, and so the tank is not working yet. So I walked around. I went to the tents that they used to live in before this village. I was really surprised, shocked when I saw these tents. They were really in bad state. And then I saw their livestock, the goats. They were walking around between the houses in the village streets. And then they told me that there's a salt lake where they collect salt from this area. It is like a landmark, a touristic attraction. So I went there, and then when I came back, I said, I didn't take any photos in the village. Let me take some photos in the village before I go back to the capital. I was shocked when I came inside the village. I found all of those who were the houses in the village, all of the locals who were supposed to live in the 100 million houses, they came back to their tents. And I came back to the houses. What was in the houses? The goats. I was shocked. The children were playing in the sun, but there were shades in the village. So I was confused, and I asked my colleagues, please don't say anything. I'll just ask the mayor of this village. He said, what is it? And I said, I asked the mayor of this village, if I am to give you $1.2 million, would you build this village, or do you have another project in mind? So it was a little awkward because the people in charge of the institution were there. But I said, please just speak frankly, because we're thinking of a project for you. Would you like another village? He said, if you would give me that money, I would make do with only half of it. I would get teachers from the capital to live with these children. Perhaps there were 100 children in this village. Because we don't have any teachers, they can't make the commute from the capital 2 hours every day from the capital. I can send some of my students to the capital to learn. You see how important learning is, and philanthropy and the compassion of philanthropy and all of these influencers who took photos and videos was not in its place. And I asked him, what about these tents? And he said, these tents, we inherited them from our forefathers. We want to live in them. And so they said the problem is that the boys and girls must be segregated at a certain age. This is why they're using these tents. And we said that we have solutions for that. So this is an example of research and the importance of research with the beneficiaries. As for us, sitting in these conferences, in air conditioners and in our institutions, thinking on their behalf on how to reform their situation, but they know better how to reform their situation.
I have prepared a scientific paper. This was prepared for my organization. This is the scientific side, and Antonio has encouraged me to change also my notes. I wrote a few notes of my own, and maybe Dr. Ghassan Kahlout will deliver the paper to you, but I would like to speak from a practical point of view. We in the Gulf countries, we are driven by our passion, really. And I come from an organization which was established as a result of a conference which was organized in Colorado in 1978. They, it was in May 1978. They sent 40 research questions to 40 bishops and religious figures to as how to convert 750,000 Muslims and others to Christianity. And those who commented on these research papers were in 720 million Muslims, in fact. Those who commented were invited. 40 research papers were collected in a book which was translated by a group of scholars supervised by the late Dr. Yusuf al-Qardawi, and it was entitled The Plan to Convert the Islamic World. And in 2017, when they asked me to join the new charitable organization, I was from Al-Rahma International Charitable Organization. I said to them, give me 1 month, I will conduct a research according to certain criteria. Then I traveled, I met one of the founders of this charitable organization. One of them was in his 90s. And I bought the book and I read the book. It's 881 pages. I was surprised that in one of the research papers in the book, this is 1978 we are talking about, they are talking about establishing a research center to help the missionaries to convert 720 million Muslims, and they called the name of Samuel Zwemer, who was in 1906 a missionary in the Muslim world. So I did my own search on the internet, and I found a platform with many amazing research papers, how to approach Muslim women, how to approach Muslim women regarding the hijab, the head cover. And now we are in 2024 talking about research centers. They established this center in 1979. You see Twitter, Instagram, all the social media platforms is all there, and they say that this website was established as a result of the 1978 conference, when the late Dr. Qardawi translated this book, and he met with the Emir of Kuwait, that time Sheikh Jabir, and in 1986 an Amiri decree was issued to counter this missionary work. So 160 scholars were invited to join. There were only 3 or 4 Kuwaitis. The rest were from all over the Muslim world. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is this organization came into existence as a result of some research. Even if we're talking about a small office, advisory office, consultancy, we still have to have the necessary research. When we established our organization in 1986, the board of directors took the decision to establish a center for research. And when the board of directors established this center, in fact, the decision was right, but they did not find the right people to run this center who knew what charitable work is all about. When I joined them, I realized that the only activity they had, or activities, were training courses. One of the training programs was on calligraphy, Arabic calligraphy, which has nothing to do whatsoever with charitable work. So we, as Dr. Khalid has said earlier on, that we really lack specialists, researchers, people come from other disciplines, and Dr. Khalid Sarahi talked about this. We really need to some strategic thinking to prepare these researchers, and later on we can distribute them to charitable work. In 2010, I left my business in the private sector and joined the charitable sector. I was in charge of some technical advice to the director, and Dr. Khalid has alluded to this. Because of my background in training, I studied the situation of it. Has been around for 16 years. It had 22 offices in 22 countries. So out of my own personal initiative, I conducted my own study that they had 160 employees, and none of them received any training in the last 10 years. So because Dr. Shireen said that some think training as something of a luxury. Of course, like the example of the village I told you about and many other projects, they just take decisions without proper research. In Syria, I remember in one of the cities which was placed under siege, the people had no food. Some resorted to killing cats and eating them. So the organization had two cows, and they wanted to slaughter them to feed people. But they had another initiative. They done some research on rabbits and how rabbits breed rapidly. They spent some 100,000 Kuwaiti dinars or $300,000. They signed an agreement with Holland, and they brought a special breed of rabbits. They found that they discovered that the population were, after they started the project and they were producing enough rabbits to be distributed, the local population did not eat rabbits because in their thinking, the organization's thinking, that they hate that people were eating cats, so they said if they eat cats, they might as well eat rabbits. Of course, we don't know how many people actually ate cats, maybe one or two somewhere, and the media exaggerated the whole thing. But I got the, all the information. I prepared a training course. I called it a refugee Dutch rabbit in Syria. Mr. AbdulRahman, you have 1 minute to wrap up. We talked about localization, maybe the last two examples, then I'll finish. The colleagues who talked about research and the importance of that, and Dr. Majid talked about this. When sometimes we start a research project, but decisions are taken and the paper is not ready yet. This is true, and Dr. Shireen talked about this, about all the disasters in the world are known, and all the previous disasters have been studied, even if in the first week they start the research. We have a study with the Islamic Bank of Development. We have been going on for 2 years. The research is entitled Dealing with Learning Difficulties for Refugees and Internally Displaced People in Disaster Areas. 146 experts from 4 countries, 9 universities, and the immediate beneficiaries are 15,000 students from countries which face disasters. So how to deal with refugees or displaced people who have to study according to curricula prepared in other countries, and a study of this size with so much expertise and so much funding will be the first of its kind in the world, which will be hopefully implemented not only for Syrian refugees but others too. So far as localization is concerned, I have this dream that when we Gulf people go to a country, I work myself for 5 years and bring 5 local organizations, 5 years on my own, 5 years with them, and 10 years later I sign a collaboration agreement with them to run capacity building courses for their own organizations, and we have come up with criteria and standards for assessment, and RACA here are doing some wonderful work, and we look forward to collaborating with them. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Now, Mr. Andrew Adam-Bradford, who is a consultant and an independent researcher with an experience of over 2 decades and with special focus on agriculture, food security, and urban agriculture and post-conflict areas. He has worked in many countries like Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Iraq, the Palestinian occupied territories, Rwanda, Kenya, and others. He was also involved in the civil war in Lebanon, also in Iraq. And Andrew is one of the editors of a book which will be published on urban agriculture.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to Dr. Gassan as well for the invitation. Privileged to be here. I'm not going to read out the title on my slide because it's going to be very difficult for the translators. So I'm just going to highlight that this is a kind of story, a reflection on an organization that is trying to bring science to the humanitarian space. Okay. And I'll unpack some of the content of that as we work through the slides. CGIAR Consultative Group of International Agricultural Research. It has a global presence over 5 continents with over 9,000 staff, mainly scientists, from 128 nationalities, a local presence in 80 countries, over 3,000 partners, and over 50 years of experience. It was kind of formulated in 1971. It has about 13 different research centers. Each center has a theme. Just to pick on some of the themes here, you may have heard of ICADA. It used to be in Syria, looking at agriculture in the dry lands. It got moved to Lebanon. It may get moved again. ILRI, livestock headquartered in Nairobi. Water center headquartered in Sri Lanka. Vegetable Research Center headquartered in Lima. So you get the idea that it's a quite decentralized with a very good global presence. And then each research theme has regional offices throughout its operating areas. I'll just quickly, they're the operating regions, so it's kind of predominantly based in the global south and in emerging economies. Anyone have a guess who this is? Big clue there. This is the 1970 Nobel Peace Prize winner, a plant scientist who developed a hybrid, fast-growing, disease-resistant form of wheat that was planted in the 60s, and because of the use of the wheat, it avoided famine in large parts of Asia and also in Latin America. But by the end of his career, he's credited to have saved 1 billion human lives for the development of different types of wheat that have then gone on and prevented famine. And in many ways also called the founder of the Green Revolution. And it's very typical of what the CG system is all about. I will now use the term CG system as an easy way of talking about this big umbrella research alliance. So predominantly, starting in the 60s, many of the centers, they focused on food security. Over time, that challenge has changed, and now it goes beyond food insecurity. It's environmental degradation, climate extremes, competition for resources, increasingly driving root causes of conflict. Syria is a classic example of conflict from competition of resources, failure to the collapse of rural development and agriculture, then leading to conflict. What's required is a transformation in land, water, and food systems in fragile and conflict-affected areas, and this is going to be key for addressing future challenges. The CG system is working to advance research-driven solutions that strengthen resilience, enhance humanitarian response, and promote human security for vulnerable communities facing emergencies, crisis, and conflict. We heard this morning about how health systems have been deliberately attacked during conflict. It's the same with food. Food always has been attacked during conflict, as far back as we look in the historical records, but also water systems now. And we see an emergence of what could be called ecocide, the deliberate targeting of natural resources. Examples are plenty now with things like the burning of crops, the destruction of trees and other agricultural areas, and we see these in different areas, Gaza, Syria, and Ukraine, destruction of the dam in Ukraine, just examples of how these systems have been targeted. One of the purposes of the CG systems are undergoing a transition in a way, and it's looking at how its historical record of development and science can be applied into humanitarian context. And one of the processes of that is looking and mapping its previous activities to see and learn lessons from its previous interventions. And we see here just a framework where individual projects have been looked at against certain parameters, such as the impact over time from a crisis, level of integration in a response. So the blue arrow at the top is a low integration, maybe a localized response, and at the bottom would be a full UN cluster response, so fully integrated, embedding science into a disaster or an emergency or a crisis as it unfolds. I've just realized that this is not the presentation that I wanted uploading, but yeah, so some of the slides are different. I'll go straight to some of the proposals from this work, rather than look at some of the examples. And it's ways, we've been talking this morning, and it's ways of how to bring science to the fore. It was very nicely mentioned previously about closing the gap and getting research on the ground much earlier. And I'd like to just talk through some examples of how that can be done. Here's one example, is embedding scientists into the humanitarian system. And in this case, it's UNHCR. So the CG has place scientists into regional or country level offices where they become they provide a technical support role for the implementing agency. Just to pull one out from this map, you could say Ethiopia, where scientists have been helping with climate risk assessments, development of programs to address the climate risk impacts in refugee hosting areas. And also it provides an opportunity for the CG system to have their resources built directly from the UN side. And it's a two-way form of information and builds capacities at both levels. But it also means that there's scientific analysis and research being conducted during, throughout a whole period of response. And in one recent example where a researcher was deployed to look at livelihoods and climate resilience, but it was prior to the planned intervention, there was a large-scale flood in South Ethiopia last year, and so this project then managed to incorporate the impact and the coping strategies of that flood during the ongoing research, mainly because it was on the ground at the time. And then had that opportunity to conduct research while humanitarian agencies are actually implementing their work. I'm going to wrap up there and take any questions. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we can open the space to receive questions. Mr. Ma'moon. Mr. Ma'moon Ariqad. I would like to thank the speakers. My question is for Mr. AbdulRahman AlMutawa. First, how is the research center financed? Is it funded by donations or at some other source? And what is the relation between the center and the philanthropy environment in Kuwait, including the academic institutions, the government institutions? So the first question is about funding. The second question is about partnership and integration and added value between the center and other philanthropy corridors, institutions, Ministry of Social Development and Affairs, is there participatory efforts between all these parties? Is there efforts that is done by all of them? And another question is, you are a member of the GCC Philanthropy Committee. It is an official committee that is affiliated with the GCC General Secretariat. Why don't you work on a central initiative that is part of the GCC strategy for research and humanitarian work? لقد تحمست أنا دائما.
One perhaps for Sandra, and I think it's a critical but very sensitive and under-exploited topic. Gender-based analysis, the promotion of women's health as part of a humanitarian is something that we are struggling very much. As part of the response just before joining WISH as a WHO for Gaza, I can tell you that there was a very stereotyped approach when it comes to women's health and humanitarian response that we need to fight. So my question is, you have now engaged with a range of different agencies, international, local ones. What has been the reception of this type of work in our region, and how much of the policy guidance notes and reports have been led to some changes in behavior, but also structurally in how we build our response in this part of the world. The second, perhaps for AbdulRahman on AlMutawa, for the GCC act often as a group, and I think it could be as a much stronger group for the good. We have our, of course, challenges. The GCC Ministerial Council, to some extent, have worked, at least in the past, in a way in strengthening our approach, and we have seen how much of we can learn from each other and countries in the humanitarian sector. But having been a practitioner myself in this part of the world, I see that, like we see with Western humanitarian organization, there was a lot of raising of the flag, and how much there's coordination, and the example that you gave on the ground, how much of the learning across the GCC is taking place for philanthropic organizations in particular that have an Islamic background.
Thank you. Dr. Ghassan.
Adam-Bradford, because I'm aware of some of your research work, Doctor. Can you please give us examples about, international humanitarian organization using your research to develop their food security programs? I'm aware of your work in Gaza with CARE International, with the American organization, where you have done research and assessment on the ground and you develop a program for them. Can you please, elaborate on this?
Thank you. Dr. Mansour.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. AbdulRahman. I really liked the 5-5-5 system. 5 on my own, 5 with others, and 5 enablers. Since you said that everything is based on studies, I want to know why we didn't choose 3-3-3. So 3 elements instead of 5. And is it about depth or quantitative access? I believe it is good to empower others. When you are taught, you teach other people. Of course, this was the way in which prisoners were freed. The price that they paid for their freedom was to teach other prisoners or teach other people. So this is what I wanted to know, the basis for this, the 5 elements, because perhaps the 10-year duration might be very long for the comprehension and enhancement of the ability for humanitarian response. Thank you. Hello. Your interventions were really valuable. My question is for Dr. AbdulRahman. I am a researcher at the Conflict and Humanitarian Affairs Studies Center. What I understood was two main notes, the localization and the importance of local forces in this work as a researcher. And what I note in this work is that the localization agenda and dealing with localization as a long-term strategy was 90% of the humanitarian work internationally and at the Arab level is not really there. So in 2023, 2024, there was funding. When we talk about funding for localization and local institutions, is very limited. It's always very limited. So in areas like Afghanistan, Syria, Palestine, Yemen, it's 2 or 3% of funding is gone to localization. So my remark is that not enough attention is given to localization and to direct financing for local work. And my question is, to what extent are we working on this at the level of the Arab world, the GCC, internationally? To what extent are we dealing with it as a long-term strategy? For example, I am conducting a study about localization of humanitarian work based in GCC countries or coming from GCC countries into conflict contexts. So I will ask about the real procedures that are being done on the field to instill localization, to enhance localization. So what differences will I find? Another thing that is a point of critique in localization of humanitarian work is the issue of power dynamics in dealing with humanitarian work. When it's done, be it by international organizations or regional organizations for the local institutions. The local institutions always lack the power in this dynamic. For example, humanitarian work in Palestine, Syria, Yemen, according to what I've seen from research, we find that international organizations are always persistent to be there or to be the main authority, the source of power in implementing projects and in imposing conditions on the local agencies. So they want to always dominate these projects. So there's discrepancy. You call for localization and empowerment of the local institutions, but you don't want to leave this project. You want to dominate it. So what procedures can we take in order to instill the principle of localization? So let's start. لنبدأ بدكتور ساندرا. السؤال كان من دكتور سليم وكان متعلقا بهذا الموضوع الحساس والمهم والمتعلق بالنوع الاجتماعي خصيصا بالنسبة للنساء. إذا كيف استجاب أصحاب المصلحة لهذا العمل، لاسيما إذا كان هنالك تأثير سياسي خلال هذا العمل؟ شكرا جزيلا لك.
Stakeholders receive this work in different ways, but to my surprise, most people are receptive and they want to engage with this line of work. They recognize the importance of this issue. Obviously, gender affects the health outcomes for everyone, women, men, whoever we are. And with regards to Muslim organizations, many of them have developed their own unique approaches to address women's issues in humanitarian work. They may use different language and different terminologies. So, for example, they may not talk about gender, what is as a gender, women and men. They may like to talk only about women, so they are specific. They will talk about women's empowerment strategies and analysis of all vulnerable groups. And here, it's so much important to continue investing efforts in capacity building to mainstream gender considerations across humanitarian sectors. There's a starting point. Cultural and religion is an important starting point. Many people will often think in Islam women are so much empowered, which brought me to this work anyway, this kind of assumption. But they will often take on defensive stance instead of proactive stance. So often Muslim stakeholders would like to defend that they are proactive and promoting women's rights, which in international humanitarian system often is associated with inequalities for women in Muslim countries, unfortunately, which is obviously untrue, and we need to challenge this stereotypes. Different organizations, starting from the OIC, have different strategies. For example, they have the OIC Action for Advancement of Women, which is a good point to build on. Islamic Development Bank has women's empowerment strategies, all these different ways of approaching. Myself, I worked before for Islamic Relief Worldwide, where I developed gender justice policy. Unfortunately, many organizations still don't take a proactive approach and don't develop specific measures to conduct gender analysis in different, let's say, women's health programs. I hope with the future engagements, we will be able to develop new approaches that are building on people's culture and faith. We call it faith-sensitive, inclusive approaches that should be developed and integrated within different organizations to maximize effectiveness of humanitarian aid, because gender insensitive aid means ineffective aid. For us to do better, we have to consider different needs of people. To promote dignity, dignity is a good starting point for all Muslim charities, and for that, we need to have specific measures for different people. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
ناس شكرا جزيلا لك مستر أو سيد أندرو. كان هنالك
The international NGOs, and if you can elaborate more about some examples who use research to develop food programs. And yes.
I would start by saying that no credit should go to the INGOs. And we always work with beneficiaries, well, not even beneficiaries, we always work with urban farmers on the ground. But what we get from an INGO is money. And what we don't get if we're on our own with our good ideas is no money. And I remember giving a presentation to DFID in Iraq. It was 2016, and they were building refugee camps. There were refugees coming in from Syria, refugees come in, IDPs come in from different parts of Iraq. And we proposed that we would green refugee camps and give livelihoods and have all these benefits from community gardens, growing food, therapeutic benefits. And the reply from DFID was, where's your evidence this works? And we kind of looked and we realized there is no evidence that it works. So what we did is we got funding from an oil company and we went and did it anyway. And during that process of implementing and greening refugee camps in Iraq, we built up an evidence base, and we did interviews, and we collected and we published in peer-reviewed journals like the Oxford Journal Studies. We did policy briefs, and there was no end of evidence all of a sudden. And we know historically that small-scale food production is vital in emergencies. Even as we speak now, seeds have been traditional seeds have been shared and used throughout this year for people to grow food in the extreme conditions of Gaza. Literally, if they're constantly moving to different areas, they're carrying containers where they're growing food. That's how important it is. And so we can look back, and there was mention about cats. In the sieges of Syria, they made a fatwa that you can eat cats because it was the last resort. And we know how humans cope under these extreme conditions from historical studies, and we have very clear ways of building capacity, and there's lots that science can bring to these extreme contexts like Gaza, Syria and Ukraine, how better to use water, how to have better crop selection, to have high nutrients, all these things, is bringing science to the subject. I think some of my best work has been done outside the humanitarian space, where we've been refused funding and we've had to, look at alternatives. And I remember doing some participatory research in a Syrian refugee camp, and we asked anyone involved in agriculture, please come to our meeting. We turned up, we had 2 PhDs, we had extension workers, we had farmers, a whole range of resources that we then galvanized. Working in Gaza, it was similar scenario where we had Palestinian extension workers, and then we retrained them not to think of pivotal agriculture in Saudi Arabia, but to think of small community gardens, a form of resilience in many ways, and mobilizing people to grow their own food, and to have, even if it's a small contribution, to have some kind of self-sufficiency and reliancy. And there's so many therapeutic benefits from that too. So, that's kind of, I hope, that's, gives some of the background to these kind of programs.
Thank you very much. الأستاذ عبد الرحمن أنا مشان الوقت حيجمع لك.
I will just give you a summary of all the questions. First, the funding of the Studies Center and its relations with the environment of philanthropy in Kuwait. Also, 2 questions about GCC, if there are any initiatives and its role as a group, or how this group can have more influence. Also, the issue of 555 and 333, and is it based on a study, and how you came up with this number, and the issue of localization and limited international funding, and to what extent can we deal with this as a long-term strategy, and the impact of power dynamics between local institutions and NGOs. Did you add a couple of questions to those? Okay, thank you. So as for the funding of the Center of Studies, it was established, as I said, in 2007 by the Philanthropy Board of Directors. So it is the highest authority. Until 2017, its work was limited, and then afterwards it was affiliated with the Philanthropy Commission. So when I joined that, I wanted to learn charity and philanthropy from studies. I didn't want to be lectured about philanthropy not based on research. So I looked in Arab countries. I did not find anything. I found in Europe many centers, and I started reading their production, but it was not related to our context. And late 2011, I contacted Midad Center. I talked to Dr. Khaled, and I flew to him, sat with him, and I learned about their work. And I came back to Kuwait, where I wrote a proposal including 4 ideas, including a research center for humanitarian work, and also another consultancy center. And I applied the Studies Center 2017, and it's part of the Charity Commission. The funding is from the Charity Commission. I asked the president of the center for something so that the policy makers, the decision makers, will not be intimidated by the funding, the huge funding of the center. I said I want this center to be commended, and we had to set standards for studies. We have a very meticulous set of standards, and they are actually annoying set of standards in our center. So this is an answer to the second question. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other government agencies, they would issue an appraisal of a situation. So these appraisals can sometimes be particular to a certain event or a certain body. So for example, an appraisal of the response with the crisis in Sudan and how we dealt with it, and this include the protection of those working in humanitarian work, and this was applied to the crisis in Gaza and the work in Gaza, and Daniel Storm and the humanitarian crisis, the humanitarian disaster in Gaza and Mediterranean, the climate change, the issue of drought in Somalia, the situation in Afghanistan and humanitarian roles, and when the US troops left Afghanistan, we issued an appraisal on how humanitarian workers can deal with that, and we sent it to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we acted preventively or before the issue took place, so that of course they have their own studies, but we provided our own anticipatory studies as well. As for the question related to the GCC, when I was asked by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to represent it in the GCC, I had something to say in the meeting with the Undersecretary of the Ministry. I said that our cooperation at the level of the GCC is something really big. We still have problems cooperating with local institutions. We still have problems with cooperation between departments in one institution. So it's a problem at smaller levels even. So when I was nominated and I went to the first meeting and I was representing Kuwait, and I led the group representing the country. In the first meeting of the committee, this committee was established 10 years ago, and today was its first meeting. So I said, wow, there's hope. So when they saw that there is this issue was nuanced and complex, they assigned someone else to represent the country in the GCC meeting. The 555, if you were my CEO and you wanted 222, I would agree. I don't mind. But as the researchers said, humanitarian work and charity work, in charity work, institutions want their names everywhere. In humanitarian work, I don't care about the logo. Supposedly, I don't care about my logo. I care about the actions that are taking place. So I have hope that 10 years from now, we will say that we have institutions that do not care about their names being mentioned. But in Islamic countries, we should really focus on philanthropy without caring about our names and our logos being visible. But these institutions want the power, want the visibility, want their names to be published everywhere. But the aim of my work must be to sow the seed and leave. And you can watch it from afar for 5 years. When you make sure that it's going in the right track, then you can you can leave this situation. So the last thing was the lack of funding for localization. The lack of funding for localization. We have an initiative to localize charity work. I need to elevate its levels. Donor institutions in Saudi Arabia have an idea that I copied actually. In late 2010, I visited Saudi Arabia many times, and I visited Abu Abdullah or Mr. Khalid in Midat Center. And when I visited the institutions, I saw the donor institutions, how they revolutionized the charity charity institutions working there by putting in place laws to get donations. In order to get donations, you need to have procedures, budget, standards, and so we took this experience and we applied that to our commission, and we set up this whole system, and no charity association now can get certificate as an institution to get donations without these procedures. Just in order to get to a level where these institutions get to a high level of work, you can receive as much as you want of grants and donations, but the prerequisite is to elevate the level in which you're working. So sometimes institutions have the eligibility to get the grants, but they are not at the level that we need. So we established a program to build the capacities of partner institutions, and it's entitled Shine. And our goal is to shine through from our charity commission into these associations. It is not about ownership. It's not about domination of these projects. No, this is about the promotion of philanthropy and charity work with government institutions and private sector institutions as well. If they are kept in the same weak level of work, then they will never develop. Thank you, Mr. AbdulRahman. Thank you, Dr. Sandra. Thank you, Mr. Andrew. We have listened to various experiences on how to use research and studies and enhance the work of humanitarian organizations. We talked about women who are forcibly displaced and localizing humanitarian work, influencing decision makers, agriculture, food production. Thank you so much for attending and listening. Peace and God's mercy be